Thank you. I appreciate the introduction. I certainly appreciate your presentation. I'm a little laissez-faire on the poem, but keep working. A haiku might be better, Steve. This presentation, I think, fits well with what Dr. Powell's just presented. It'll be somewhat redundant, and I would suggest that this is not a presentation addressed to those of you with a background in weed science, but rather this is a presentation for those of you who we have invited and who you have accepted our invitation to participate in the Herbicide Resistant 2 Summit that may not have an understanding of what is possible with regard to managing herbicide-resistant weeds. As Dr. Coble, who I have known a couple years, mentioned, I have been involved in herbicide-resistant weeds pretty much most of my career. I remember at the University of Illinois in the 70s dealing with atrazine resistance, certainly in the 80s and 90s dealing with ALS resistance, and in the early 2000s, and this was mentioned earlier, I and Chris Borboom, who was at that time at the University of Wisconsin, put forward national symposiums on the sustainability of glyphosate and addressed these issues, and were summarily dismissed, at least at the first one, because it wasn't a problem. And we went back and did another one about 2 years later, and Dr. Coble participated in that when he was with the USDA. And one of the things that came out of that symposium as a goal, as an outcome, was to label herbicides with their mechanism of action. And I think that one was in 2006 or 2005, and it's finally becoming part of the idea. So what I would like to talk about briefly is issues that are part of the problem that we have for herbicide-resistant weeds. I'll use Iowa as sort of the poster child, and I will talk about other tactics other than herbicides, okay? And we'll go from there. And Dr. Kells mentioned that he had read my little summary, and it surprised him because it wasn't particularly controversial. Jim, I apologize. I'll do better. I'll do better. But basically, when you look at weed management, historically, there have not been a lot of changes in tactics. Okay, we have cultural tactics, we have mechanical tactics, we have herbicidal tactics, and I should have included biological tactics. They conceptually have not changed a lot, but the reality, as we have moved through the technology, things have changed rather dramatically. And notably, the change in genetic engineering for crops with herbicide resistance to previously non-selective herbicides has been a major change in global agriculture. Unprecedented in the 6 millennia or so that agriculture has been partaken by man. And what's interesting is that not only have these changes, these technological advances and the adoption of these tactics changed the agriculture, but it has also changed with regard to social concerns, groundwater, water quality, and has also changed with regard to the economics. And so this has been a major issue, and as Dr. Powell's indicated, as a result, you know, people are starting to look at simple, convenient, and inexpensive solutions to what are the most consistent problem for food production globally, which would be weeds. Not usually very showy, and they kind of get dismissed because of some sort of a new soybean disease or a nematode or something like that, but nevertheless the consistency of economic loss attributed to weeds is unprecedented. All right? There are some problems that we have. There are problems in managing herbicide resistance, even though it's widespread. And one of them is grower knowledge. Growers no longer, as a general statement, understand weed biology. They no longer understand herbicide chemistry. They no longer understand some of the basic precepts of weed management. And the reason is indirectly attributable to the adoption of this technology. We have seen declining numbers of growers. I think in Iowa we lose about 5% of the farmers every year, either through, if you will, attrition or they retire. Okay, I think right now we're looking at about 60% of the acres in Iowa that are farmed are not farmed by the owner. Okay, so that's a change. And succinctly, what we have is fewer farmers farming more acres over greater distances. And this has been made effective as a general statement by these new technologies, herbicidal-based weed management. And so now all of a sudden, we have a time management problem because they're doing this same agricultural practices over larger areas in the same 24-hour day. And so change in that regard has major, major implications. Similarly with the economics, if you start diversifying your weed management tactics, it's going to cost more money. And that is a concern, particularly now with declining markets that we have and so forth. And then finally, historically, the industry has ridden in every time there has been a problem. Triazine resistance, PS2 resistance, no sweat. We have ALS inhibitor herbicides. ALS inhibitor herbicide resistance, no sweat. We've got glyphosate. Well, glyphosate problems are here, as Dr. Powles has described. And there are no new herbicides in the immediate future. And by new herbicides, I mean new specific mechanisms of action. Okay? And so, in fact, the last new mechanism of action that was commercially registered, I think, was discovered about 25 years ago, and that would have been, if I'm not wrong, Janice, the HPPD inhibitor herbicides. And so we've got some problems there. And this is not due to a lack of research, although it lagged a little bit in the 90s and in the early part of the 2000s, but we are still, the industry is still looking for new herbicides. So, first question. The current problems with herbicide-resistant weeds increases the likelihood that growers will diversify weed management programs beyond simply changing herbicide programs. Number one, yes. And number two, What do you think, Harold?
I'll tell you after the
Okay, survey says, well, look at that. I couldn't have done it better. Thank you. You have met exactly my expectations. Like nobody knows. So, part of the problem is what does go back. Part of the problem is what growers really think herbicide resistance is. And I know for a couple of years, the shock and awe strategy of alerting the Midwestern soybean producers as to what resistance looked like. They'd take them down, contact Jason or Larry Steckel or somebody down in the Mississippi Delta and say, look at that. And they would go, oh my goodness, looking at the Palmer pigweed problems and stuff. And then they get back in their truck or they get back in their plane and they go back and boy, am I glad I'm not them suckers. Because they perceived this, the train wreck, as herbicide resistance. And the reality is that herbicide resistance actually looks like this. We did a survey recently, and it was random, and 77% of the Iowa soybean fields in 2013 had weeds above the canopy in September when we did this survey, and we sampled these. And weeds above the canopy in September correlates very nicely with the likelihood that those are herbicide-resistant weeds. And the problem, again, gets back to the demographics in that we have a lot of acres each grower is trying to manage. And they don't have time to go and look at these weeds above the canopy. They maybe will see them during harvest, but then it's too late. And so we have a preponderance of the fields with herbicide resistance. And the problem is that in most of these fields, we can see them as we do our surveys. The growers don't recognize them. And it isn't until, and this is based on some old modeling data from 20, 30 years ago, but growers sort of have a threshold of recognizing herbicide-resistant weeds. And this is what they recognize. They know then that they've got a problem. This is not what they recognize. And estimates of somewhere between 25 and 35% of the weed population must have the resistance trait before growers recognize that they have that problem, which means that they have undergone several reproductive cycles. And by the time they recognize that they have the problem, then it's too late. They have the problem. Because of dormancy and the high fecundity of seed production of these weeds, it doesn't go away. And so that's the real problem. So what do we do about it? How can we address that, and how can we address that now? And the slide depicts a lot of ideas and everything, but the key is site-specific weed management. And the real key is our friend Dr. Dale Shaner, boots on the ground, scouting. Scouting is how we can understand where we are with weed management, and is how we can address managing herbicide-resistant weeds. And I'll go through real briefly, the general tactics. Tillage is key for managing weeds, herbicide-resistant weeds, very important. But it has risks. Runs afoul oftentimes of federal programs. It requires time. It uses petroleum fuel and thus is costly. But tillage must be included as a tactic for managing herbicide-resistant weeds. I'll talk to a grower and I'll say, you really should be cultivating. And they look, their eyes glaze over if they have a cultivator, and they say, I don't have the time nor the inclination to control weeds mechanically. But we go back to the concept of site-specific management. Each field is different. Each field needs to be managed separately from all of the other fields that a grower may have in their farming operation. And they say, well, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time for specific strategies. I want simple, I want convenient, I want cheap. And I will say to them, I says, no, wait a minute. Do you plant the same corn hybrid on all of the acres that you produce corn? And they say, of course not. And you ask them why, and they say, well, because I am managing risk by using different crop cultivars. Similarly with soybean, and I suspect cotton may be the same. I don't have a clue about that, but I'll just nod Jason and I'll be, oh, he says it's okay. And fertility programs, they site-specific manage fertility because soils differ, rotations differ, and so forth. So they're already doing this site-specific management, just not for weed management, because they have become accustomed to that which is simple and convenient. Tillage needs to be included. Mechanical control of seed banks, as suggested by Dr. Powell's, needs to be a consideration. This is interesting. And we talk about innovation and grower innovation. And this is a little system, it's like cultivation, but it's sort of sustainable in many respects. And this is something that Frank Forcella and some of our colleagues in the USDA and at SDSU are working on. And basically what this is an applicator of a grit that is blown under pressure between the rows onto the weeds. And it works quite well. As you can see on the right, that you do a pretty good job. You don't end up disturbing the soil. And this is a viable strategy, time-consumptive but viable. What's interesting is that this is a result of a desire of PepsiCo, who do not want to make Doritos out of corn that has been treated with a herbicide. Now, okay, eat a bag of Doritos or eat a bag of Doritos that herbicide-free corn. I don't know which is more risky. But the point is that there are other strategies that one could use. Cultural tactics are an easy way to achieve weed management and an easy way to achieve herbicide-resistant weed management. But it too is very complex because it runs afoul of government programs in some respects. Right now, profitability is a huge issue. Cellulosic ethanol and ethanol production out of corn is driving continuous corn in the upper Midwest. And obviously, if we could improve the crop rotation diversity, we would improve weed management. And there's a lot of ways to do this. Temporal changes, summer annuals versus spring grains. Date of planting can be adjusted for soybeans, for example, which can be used as a strategy for weed management. Row spacing and inclusion of perennial forages is a really good example. And there is renewed interest. And a lot of this was driven by the work in Georgia and in the Mississippi Delta, looking at cover crops to help deal with Palmer amaranth. Very effective. We are starting to do a lot of this. We've had several hundred-fold increase in cover crops in Iowa this last year. I think we're up to 220,000 acres out of about 22 million row crop acres. Small adoption, but very useful. A very good opportunity. Row spacing, I think, is clear, historic. You look at 30-inch rows and velvet leaf that emerged at V2 versus 15-inch rows with a similar emergence. You can see the benefits of weed management there. Biological tactics generally are not thought to be a good feature for row crop weed management. But, but they are good. You look at some of the perennial orchards and things like that. You've got a lot of different bugs. And if we look at the example here for purple loosestrife, we can see that we're attacking the roots, the seed, and so forth and so on. But there's been some very good research done that biological control in row crops is excellent and can be enhanced through management of the cover, increasing the number of crickets, increasing the number of white-footed deer mice, who will predate a high population, a high number of the weed seeds that are at the soil surface. So we can utilize some of these cultural tactics without great cost, without great time consumption, just recognizing those abilities that are there. In the future, robotics is a possibility. There's discussions about nanotechnology such that we could encapsulate or formulate herbicides that would be more responsive to specific environmental conditions, that would improve their consistency of control, and some of the omics, genomics and proteomics and stuff like that, RNA technology would be an example of some things down the future that may help managing herbicide-resistant weeds. Are they going to answer all of the questions? Absolutely not. But they are another tool in the toolbox. The key is diversity. The key is utilizing numerous strategies on specific fields, addressing the needs of the fields and managing, developing the program, utilizing tillage, utilizing cover crops, and so forth. And importantly, grower expectations need to reflect the control that each of these tactics may provide. They expect a tactic, because this is what they've gotten in the past, they expect a tactic to provide 100% weed control. And the biological, the cultural, and the mechanical strategies are not going to do that, but they are going to be additive such that by including a little bit of tillage and a row crop and things and a cover crop, that you're going to build up, and more importantly, you're going to support the herbicide chemistry that we have. So what we would like to see, what I think must happen, is we need to lessen the reliance upon the herbicides for weed control. We need to lessen the herbicidal approaches for managing herbicide-resistant weeds, and we need to increase the importance of the other strategies. Second question, will growers adopt more diversity in herbicide-resistant weed management programs before resistance in fields reaches levels that decrease farm profits? Yes or no? On the clock. You want to guess on this one? And I don't think we have a biased sample here, I'm afraid. So, and the survey says, again, meets my bias, meets Dr. Cobal's bias, and this obviously, I think, speaks loudly as to the challenges that we have after the herbicide-resistant Summit 2 is finished. How do we reverse those? And that's going to be the real question. In conclusion, diversity, we need to address fields by specific fields and address tactics for those specific field problems. That's diversity. Diversity means that we need to look at long-term weed management programs. Herbicides need to be listed. In 2014, I'm using these herbicides, and in 2015, I'm going to use different herbicides and so forth. And not just names, not just companies, but actual mechanisms of action. All right? And this needs to be done, again, utilizing boots-on-the-ground scouting so that they know specifically what the problems are. And diversity means that growers need to understand that an escaped weed here or there is a problem, is the problem. And I already told about what has happened in Iowa with the Palmer amaranth. Very disappointing to me. And diversity means that we need to do this immediately. My calls to action, again, Premier, Blaine, this is for you, scouting is critically important to implement more diversity in weed management programs. We need to develop specific programs, whether public or private. This is a community action sorts of things that we've already heard about. We need to deal with escapes. And we need to, if you will, kind of police our neighbors to make sure that they are not contributing to the problem, to reduce the density of herbicide-resistant weeds. And we need to incentivize innovation. This comes from the growers. This comes from the private sector. We need to incentivize non-chemical weed management practices and incentivize adoption of same. Thank you very much.